this time, we'll have our feature presentation by Vern Brummel on the history of railroads, entitled Rails Through Fitchburg. Vern?
Thank you, Richard. Everybody hear me back there? I want to welcome everybody here. Thanks for coming. I'll do the first one. First of all, Allison, my daughter, is helping me out here. I'm not used to PowerPoint. I'm not a high-tech person. Very low-tech person, actually. Anyway, today's discussion will cover the three railroads that serve Fitchburg. The Illinois Central, which came through here in 1887, was the last of the railroads that served Madison.
Yep.
Madison at one time had 9 different railroad lines, 3 railroads and 9 different lines, and the IC was the last one in 1887. The Northwestern Ridge Runner was 1881, was a branch line, and the Chicago Northwestern Madison subdivision was the one main line that Madison did have. It was a double track, heavy traffic main line that came through originally in 1864. And these were not Madison's first railroads. Milwaukee, what would become the Milwaukee Road, came through in 1854. So we'll be covering the Illinois Central line. Is this red line, came up through here. They had a station building, actually called Fitchburg, down at Went Road, just south of Adams Road, just north of County Highway M, and Fitchburg Road is down here. And they also had a secondary station called Stoner's, which was like I'll see a picture of it later there, but it was like a shelter, and at one time they had a boxcar there for maintenance away, storage of tools. It was also known as Beanville, and I'll tell the story about that later. Then we'll have the Ridge Runner line of Northwestern, which comes this way, touches the northern edge of Fitchburg, and the main line, the former main line of Northwestern that came up through here and actually had a depot at Sign. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to general information. As most people know, Wisconsin became a state in 1848. Madison established as the capital, and it took a while for the railroads to come here, 6 years for Milwaukee Road and much later for the others, but by that time railroad construction was pretty well going full steam in the east. Baltimore had the first railroad in 1830, and by 1848, when Wisconsin became a state, Boston was a major rail center, and Fitchburg, Massachusetts, which Fitchburg's named after, was a major railroad center as well, and they had their own railroad called the Fitchburg Railroad. And that their station in Boston in 1848 was one of the largest stations in the world at that time. It was like a huge castle, and that building was destroyed by fire in 1925. But this far west, 1854, for what would become Milwaukee Road, that's kind of on the early side for this part of the country, because some states like Washington, Oregon, and stuff did not receive railroads till the 1880s, 1890s. We'll go to the next one. So I'm going to begin my discussion with the Illinois Central line. And the next picture. Okay. Illinois Central is one of the oldest railroads in America. It doesn't exist anymore. Today's Illinois Central is now part of Canadian National, which, despite the title, Canadian National actually serves New Orleans, Memphis, and throughout the southern states. But Illinois Central now runs over, the only line left on this map goes from Chicago to Dubuque. That's the CN line today. And that was the main line for the Iowa division of Illinois Central. And in the early time period, there was a split of that, and it's the Wisconsin division. And that was made up of this line, and the line going north to Madison and over to Dodgeville was all part of the Wisconsin division. And there was they consolidated later, and both the Dodgeville and Madison lines were part of the Iowa division. This was a main line that had a lot of traffic going through Rockford, Freeport, Galena, Dubuque. It continued on to Waterloo, Iowa, which was a major center for Illinois Central, and continued on to Omaha, Nebraska, Sioux Falls, Sioux City, and they had a lot of passenger trains on that route, and one of them was the Hawkeye, which went all the way across the state of Iowa, appropriate name for that Hawkeye state. That lasted till Amtrak. Last run was made on April 30th, 1971. They also had a secondary train called the Land of Corn that ran until 1967. Before that, a number of trains were running, and The Madison train sort of indirectly connected at Freeport with these trains. So if you lived along the IC lines, either Dodgeville or Madison, you could take a train south to Freeport and connect with the IC trains going to Chicago and beyond. Not shown on my map, there was also an IC line that went straight south out of Freeport that went down to Champaign area. And Milwaukee Road passed through Freeport. Northwestern had a line over there, and there's also an electric interurban line that came over from Rockford. So Freeport at one time was quite a railroad center. Now from Freeport to Red Oak, all the traffic that would come to Madison and to Dodgeville would pass through, and then there was a junction at Red Oak. In the early days, as many as 14 trains a day went as far as Red Oak. 6 went on to Dodgeville, and 8 went on to Madison. Go on next one. Okay, up here in Fitchburg, this is taken from a 1910 engineering drawing that they had for engineering, for drainage, for bridges and that type of thing. And this shows the location of the Fitchburg depot. It's labeled there, and there's a siding down in there. There was a siding in Fitchburg for a passage of trains, also to serve a lumber yard, a coal yard. There was a stockyard pen and a feed mill. And that the siding actually outlasted the depot by a few years. The depot was built in 1888 and was torn down between 1939 and 43. And shortly after that, the siding was taken out, and Fitchburg was no longer recognized in the Illinois Central timetable, but it still continued to pass through there. This is first of 3 scenes that I have of the Fitchburg depot. This was taken in 1923, looking south towards Freeport. And the agent at that time was a lady that lived with her family upstairs. All the agents that worked there had their families upstairs and lived there, because there wasn't any hotel or anything like that in this area. And they were kind of like a full-time person for the railroad there. They sold tickets, they took care of freight, there was a lot of business, sold telegrams for Western Union, and Rosella was her name. And I'm not sure just how many agents worked there, but quite a few over the years. And that building in front of it is a small shed that was used for the storage of milk. And at this point, when this picture was taken, there were 8 trains a day passing through here, 4 passenger trains that stopped at the depot and 4 freight trains. This is a closer up shot of the Fitchburg depot, and this is one of the many trains that passed through here, and a number of folks getting on that particular day to go up to Madison. And this is looking the other way. This is looking a picture of the depot looking towards Madison. And my guess here is that if it wasn't the station agent, it probably was the track supervisor who maintained the track, and probably his children. The second station of Illinois Central that served Fitchburg was Stoner, also known as Stoners, and that was where Seminole Highway crossed Illinois Central line, and that's where the bike trail is going to cross through there. And there was a small shed there, and at one time there was a boxcar body that they put there, and the maintenance, the way people use it for storage of tools. But the shed was used as a flag stop for passenger trains and for the pickup of milk. And we'll go to the next. 3 scenes from there. And at Stoner's until 1916, it just looked plain like the top and bottom picture. But in 1916, around Halloween, pranksters painted Beanville onto that station building, and that would stay for the next 22 years. And Beanville comes from this farmer that had a lot of soybeans that he planted around there, and there wasn't much soybean production at that time, so they considered it kind of weird, all the soybean fields, and so they painted Beanville on there, but the name stuck. This was employee time to issue to employees for the Wisconsin division, including the Fitchburg line, and this was in 1922. And if you go to the next one, this shows the traffic on both lines. There were the 4 trains going through to Madison through Fitchburg, and the 3 to Dodgeville. And this is from the opposite direction. Now, over time, this was like the peak. In 1929, 1 passenger train was discontinued, and in 1931, traffic was down to just one mixed train a day plus another general freight. So after 1931, there was not any pure passenger train serving Fitchburg, only a mixed train of freight and passenger. The Dodger line got even worse shape. At the end of the 1930s, traffic was down to just one tri-weekly mixed train a day, and by 1941, there just wasn't enough traffic anymore, and Illinois Central applied to abandon operations. And the government was kind of reluctant to let the line go, but then it was suggested that they sell the rail for the war effort after the war had started. And so then the government said, sure, we'll get rid of the line. So in 1942, the line was abandoned, the rail was melted down and made into tanks, things like that for the war effort. But all these towns lost all rail service at that time, which includes Hollandale, Blanchardville, Argyle, and so on. And to this day, none of them have grown a whole lot, and that's in part because of the early abandonment of the river. Dodger was served by Northwestern, which I'll cover later, and the fact they still had Northwestern service, they were really unaffected by the icy abandonment. On the Madison line, it would remain prosperous for freight well into the 50s and into the 60s. They had 2 freight trains a day. A lot of that was coal going to University of Wisconsin heating plant, but there's a lot of general merchandise, a number of stuff, livestock, there was fruit that was shipped, ice, and in fact, speaking of ice, there was a spur line that connected to the Madison line around Commonwealth Avenue in Madison and ran over and crossed Monroe Street, kind of where Michael's Frozen Custard is today, and went down to the lake, and there was a big ice plant down there, the Knickerbocker Ice Company. And they were a major customer. They shipped anywhere from 25 to 50 carloads of ice a day, so they had to switch it twice a day. And that was hauled to Chicago, Milwaukee, and other places. And that line was taken out in 1936. By that time, things were trucked. Their main thing was refrigeration, with refrigerators and that type of thing had taken over the technology of the old ice box. Okay. This was a passenger, a self-propelled gasoline motor car that IC experimented with from 1908 to 1910. The IC line in Madison never was heavily used for passengers. And even as early as 1908, they're trying to figure out how can we cut costs on the passenger trains. So they experimented with this McKean motor car, which is gasoline powered. And did more people ride it because of that? It was yes and no. Some people rode it because it was futuristic for its time. For 1908, this thing was like a bullet-shaped thing, and there were some science fiction novels that came out by Jules Verne, and some people said this is like a spaceship or something, so they wanted to ride it for that reason. But for that reason, it was so modern looking, it scared away a lot of people, that they want nothing to do with this contraption from the future. And this had portholes on the side, and some people thought it was a traveling ship. And it had a couple of nicknames, the Red Devil and Maud. And I have no idea where Maud came from. But as far as the Illinois Central was concerned, it saved money because they didn't have a full crew and they only had one car to, but the thing fell apart so many times because the McKean Company built a lot of motor cars, and by the 1930s they were successful in their business, but not in 1908 when they came up with their product, and a lot of mechanical breakdowns, and that's the real reason why IC dropped using this in 1910. This, by the way, is the bridge over the Northwestern Ridge Runner line that I'll be covering a little bit. Copy of the 1933 passenger timetable. If you went to any railroad station in America, there'd be a rack of timetables, not just for the railroad that we stopped at, but for other railroads from around the country. When I lived in Partyville, which had no passenger service at the time, you could still go to the local depot, and he would have a rack of passenger timetables for all the railroads serving the area. And this is an example of what IC published in 1933. And at that time, we only had the one train a day that carried passengers. And as you can see, the train stopped at Fitchburg at 11 a.m. in the morning and 1:12 in the afternoon, but Stoners was shown in the timetable as a flag stop. Now, going further towards Madison, there was a station called Summit, and that lasted to the very end of rail operations. Summit was the industrial area where Home Depot and that grocery store and all that stuff that used to be Nakoma Plaza, that whole development there is where Summit used to be. And there was a number of sidings in there. They served cold storage, they served oil company, Brunzell Lumber, a number of different things. And Brunzell Lumber, by the way, at Summit, was the very last customer to serve on the IC line that they had, the very last customer. And Wingrove Park was a little station building that was at the corner of Monroe Street and Regent Street, across from the UW Fieldhouse. And that was a flag stop for all passenger trains. That was removed pretty early, 1932, but it remained a flag stop. There's a platform there after that. Here's a picture of a northbound IC mixed train in 1937, and this was taken, obviously, we had a lot of rain. And I guess the line was not closed this day, but it did a lot of property damage from what I heard. Now, this is what I remember from the Illinois Central line, because I lived along it for 1 year, and I would see these black GP9 locomotives of Illinois Central come up from Freeport. It was daily except Sunday. Then my brother lived in Madison and on Gregory Street, and his backyard had this track behind it. And I remember seeing, even on Sunday, occasionally IC would come up with these black Jeeps, occasionally two of these units together. So this is how I remember the Illinois Central, with these black locomotives coming up to Madison, usually daily except Sunday. Now this was taken at Summit, so this shows you what it was like at Summit long before Home Depot and the whole complex. And this was taken in 1973 when we still had the daily freight coming up here. And the station sign was typical Illinois Central, where they had the horizontal and vertical signs. And the Summit station sign actually existed after the track was taken out. They did not remove the sign until 2001, long after the track had been removed. In 1973, a friend of mine, Gordy Brocker, and we wanted to take a ride on the Illinois Central. We figured if it comes up on a Saturday, why don't we go to where the crew is in Madison and ask them for permission to ride with them? And what's the worst thing that can happen? Is say, get out of here, fine. But what if they say yes? So we planned ahead. Well, there's a bus that runs from Freeport to Madison later in the day. Maybe if we can talk them into letting us ride along, how much fun that would be to ride the IC line. So I said, let's go for it. So the night before, we called the Wallace Yard, Freight Yard in Freeport, Illinois, the Illinois Central Yard, and said, are you going to be running a train to Madison tomorrow? And they said, just a minute. Hey, Mac, you running to Madison tomorrow? Yep, we're running up there tomorrow morning. We'll be up there around 10. So I told up the Gordy and says, let's get down there. So we went down to the yard, which was on West Washington Avenue, a block down from the Milwaukee Road yard. And it was just a small yard, but there was a freight station there. Illinois Central had an office at 604 West Washington Avenue. And that was a brick building. Across the street was this large, at one time, a large passenger station Illinois Central had. That was torn down by that time. And there was there was a gas station there at that time. Later, that became the Badger Bus Depot site, and now it's being redeveloped again. But the freight station was still there and was in use by the IC, and that became Jimmy Carter's campaign headquarters in 1976, his northernmost headquarters. And they even put the station sign Plains North on this depot building. And after that, U-Haul bought the building, and now thanks to U-Haul, it's still standing, and it's been in U-Haul use since 1977, and they haven't made too many changes. So that's one part of IC that still exists today in Madison, is the old freight station. But going back to 73, we were down by that freight station, and that crew came up with their locomotive, and we went up and says, hey, we're rail fans from the area. Is there any chance we could ride with you down to Freeport? And so our hearts were kind of beating. And he says, there's IC officials around today. Meet us down at the Bratwurst stand on Regent Street. So we raced down there to an approximate location where that Wingrove Park depot was, corner of Monroe and Regent. And in a few minutes, the freight train came right up to us. The crew got off. They were going to go to this Bratwurst stand to get brats for lunch and drinks. And this old guy came out of the conductor, and he came up to me and said, all right, you two, get into the caboose. So he introduced himself as Bob Calkins. And so we got into the caboose. We were really excited. I mean, we were both pretty young. I mean, I'd be excited now today if this happened. So we got into the cruise, and the rest of the crew was in there, introduced themselves, and Mr. Calkins finally got up there with a bunch of brats, and he says, "You're not getting any of these brats. You're lucky you're riding on the rails with us." And he says, "Good heavens, you people." And he had quite the nerve. Then he had a smile on his face. So then we continued on, and we rode in the west side of Madison through Commonwealth, we passed Midville Boulevard, across the Belt Line, and it was a lot of fun. And then we pulled up to Summit, and we spent 40 minutes switching all the industries. It was that much business in 1973 yet, that it took 40 minutes to switch all the industries. Well, along the way, when we were switching, a hippie couple, there were a couple of long-haired hippies, long stringy hair, wire rim glasses, peace symbols, the whole thing out of 1969. Except this was 73, but they looked like 69. "Hey man, can you give us a ride to Monroe, man?" And the conductor says, "Get aboard. There's 2 of you on here already." So these hippies got on the caboose with me, Gordy, and conductor Calkins says, "I'm running a regular Amtrak train here." So we pulled out of Summit, went down through Fitchburg, and I remember pointing out, "Hey, we're going through Fitchburg right now." That's where the Fitchburg Depot was, and Belleville and Basco, and we got through the Stewart Tunnel, which is this neat tunnel that still exists and will be there for the bike trail. It was like about a 1,000-foot long tunnel between Belleville and Monticello. So that was cool going through that. And shortly after that, though, blam, then we came to a quick halt. Calkins got on his radio, says, "Now what?" And the engineer says, "We just hit a cow." And Calkins says, "That's all we need. First I'm running an Amtrak train, and now we're hitting cows." He says, "It's time for my return." So anyway, we got down to Monroe, dropped off the hippies, and then the locomotive uncoupled, went into town there was a spur that went downtown Monroe and served the Huber Brewery, and went down there, and it came back, and Calkins says, "Well, got rid of the hippies, but still got 2 of you left." And anyway, we pulled out of Monroe and went down the remaining 20 miles down to Freeport to Wallace Yard. And Calkins asked us, "How you guys getting back to Med City?" And he said, "Well, we're going to take a Badger bus." "Come on, home with me. My daughter's making lunch. Well, she'll make it for you guys too." So he lived in a little modest little house down by the tracks, and was introduced to his daughter, and she had a really nice lunch. And after that, Mr. Calkins took us down to the Badger bus depot. You can't even do that anymore since Badger doesn't serve Freeport anymore. But we thought that was really neat. And a few months later, in February 1974, Amtrak reinstated service on that line I showed you that went through from Dubuque through Freeport, Rockford, Illinois, to Chicago, Illinois, and the name of the train was the Blackhawk. And it was a 3-car self-propelled train, rail diesel cars, and it was a modern version, really, of that gas car that I showed you a picture of. And that was fun riding that, but I was surprised by who the conductor was, and it was Bob Calkins, an Amtrak conductor now out of Freeport. And so I says, "Bob, do you remember us?" He says, "How can I forget you two?" And I said, "Well, now you're running a real Amtrak train." He said, "Yeah, I'm going to put up with you now." Anyway, Bob retired a few years after that, but it was really neat riding the Black Hawk when Bob Calkins was our conductor. So we'll go on to the next railroad. Chicago Northwestern's Ridge Runner. Well, the Ridge Runner name comes from the line that went west from Madison. It went to Camp Badger, which today, you'll know it is where the Star Cinema Theater is, the feed mill, the beverage warehouse, and all that stuff. There's a PDQ down there. Anyway, that was at one time a National Guard camp, and passenger trains had flags stopped at Camp Badger. When the National Guard moved out to Truex Field, I assume, then that became redeveloped as an industrial park and what it is today. County home was what it is today, the Dane County home, just east of Verona, 1 mile east of Verona, and that was a flag stop for trains. Verona and then all these towns going west was part of this network called the Ridge Runner, and that was, the name was taken from the hill country out there. The line went curving left and right and up and down hills, and had a lot of grades, and it was a very picturesque line, and it went through all these ridges, so picked up the name the Ridge Runner a long time ago. And along the line there, Mount Horeb, Blue Mountains, Barneveld, had the Barneveld Depot survived, to 1984, it would have been taking a direct hit by that terrible tornado that they had that year. It went right through town where the railroad was and destroyed everything in the path. Ridgeway, that's the only depot still standing along the line today. The Ridgeway Depot, the track is long gone, but Ayers Furniture in Ridgeway saved the depot from destruction in 1964 and kept it as storage. And now the community has restored it, and it's a beautiful depot. They did a real good job of restoring it. And Ridgeway is also the home of the Ridgeway Ghost. I don't know if anybody here knows the story of the Ridgeway Ghost, but it's a local legend of theirs that it goes back to the 1800s, early 1800s, of this mysterious ghost that made its appearance. And when the railroad came through in 1881, that's when this line was built, he mysteriously disappeared, and they say it's because he was afraid of the cowcatcher and all that, the locomotive. But other people have told me they've heard of the Ridgeway Ghost making an appearance long after that, and one appearance that he made was south of town on this one-town road, and somebody went down there to determine that this particular ghost at that location was simply the headlights of a car reflected off the tombstones of a cemetery down there. Anyway, the line continued down Dodgeville and served some industries in Dodgeville, and actually there is another depot left, kind of. The old Dodgeville depot was moved north to the Don Q Inn, and they've modified it, but they use it as some of their rooms. And the Northwestern got a white metal trailer for their depot in latter years, and then when they closed the line, they moved the trailer to a little town in southern Minnesota, and then it's been removed from there now since. Montfort Junction was the junction of the line going down to Galena, Illinois, with branches to Platteville, Hazel Green, and then it continued to Lancaster Junction, branches to Lancaster and to Whitman. So you can see there's a number of spokes, branches that came off of this branch line. Now from Fenimore to Whitman, that was a narrow gauge line. The topography was so hilly there that they could not build a wide gauge line, a standard gauge line, so they had to build this real narrow gauge line, similar to what was constructed in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And that line, there was no population. I mean, Fenimore was the biggest town, 1,000 people. Whitman was the second biggest town, about 500 people. And then the third biggest town, Worley, had a population of 30. And that was it along the line. And Whitman and Fenimore were served by other railroads. So it's amazing that the line lasted from about 1880 to 1926. It was finally taken out in 1926. And that was the first cutback of this network of lines. And the second was cutting back from Galena to Hazel Green about 1940. Then it was cut up to Strawbridge, just south of Benton there, in 1942. And then in 1967, cut back further to Cuba City. But from 1967 to 1980, the rest of the lines remained in place, all the way to Platteville, Cuba City, Lancaster, and Fenimore.
I just did a tour of the Potosi Brewery, and they talked about rail lines. Would they have connected with the Lancaster, Potosi?
No. Potosi is on the Burlington Northern line, Burlington Northern Santa Fe today, the old Burlington main line, and that's still very, very active. But the topography prevented anything from being built because there was talk of Lancaster being built to the Mississippi River or Platteville, but it was way too hilly, would have been way too expensive to build tunnels and all these bridges and everything that would have been needed. So the money wasn't there. They couldn't raise enough stock, but there was talk of building west, even from Fenimore, but it's just too hilly out there. And for the same reason, the main line going through Potosi, they never built branches going into Wisconsin further because of topography. They didn't think it was worth the construction cost to serve these towns. There's a number of towns out that direction, Grant County, that never had rail service and wanted it, but it just was too expensive to reach them in those days. But Potosi today, there used to be a nice depot there. It's gone, but that's a heavily used line, Burlington Northern Santa Fe. Okay, go on. Now this shows two of the lines. The rail closest to us is Illinois Central. This was the same location that I showed you that motor car picture earlier, and taken quite a few years after that. And this shows the line crossing the Ridge Runner line. Now we're looking towards Highway PD. The track's curving to the left. It's about to go into that industrial park, cross Highway PD, and continue on to Verona. This was Verona. This is actually one of the first color slides I took. This was taken October 1971. And Verona had just lost its depot like maybe a year or two before that. And this was a downtown Verona, looked like that. If you go to this same spot today, we do not recognize it. It's completely all developed. None of these trees, that silo there is long gone. There's nothing left from here. It's all changed into businesses and stuff. But this is what where the depot used to be. And the next picture shows what the Verona depot looked like. This was typical of depots built along the Ridge Runner line. There were small affairs, wooden affairs, and Northwestern's probably stopped maintaining most of them back in the 40s and 50s. So at the end, the Verona depot was kind of run down. It was closed in 1964. The line had passenger service on it until December 1950, and then after that, you were allowed to ride in the freight train that they had until 1956. So in 1955 or so, if you wanted to go to Mount Horeb, you could actually buy a ticket in the Verona depot and ride this freight train to Mount Horeb and beyond. I don't think too many people did that. And in 1964, because there wasn't enough freight business left in Verona to warrant a full-time agent, they closed it. Then it sat there for a few years. I think this picture was taken in 1965. It lasted a few more years after that, then it was demolished. Oh, one other thing about Verona is that it's hard to get pictures of that station. It's the only one I've seen pictures of. I called the Verona Library one time and happened to talk to a librarian that's been there for all her life. And she says, you know, that depot was such a rundown thing. We all were happy to see it go. It was an eyesore. But now all of us are saying, why didn't we save it? That was part of our city history. It's a tragedy that we let that depot be torn down. Okay, the last part of my talk is going to be on the big main line that we had at one time, the Madison subdivision.
Right. Point out that there is a picture of the Riley station down at.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Wendy Lacey put up a huge display back there, which is so nice, of all these pictures of area railroads, and includes the only picture I've ever seen of Riley.
Right.
Riley was the first station west of Verona. It was Verona, Riley, Clevenville, and then Mount Horeb. And it's just got the Riley Tavern now, but it used to have the depot and a number of things. And I was surprised myself that there was a depot at Riley. And so anyway, go on up, those who haven't, go on up and look at Wendy's display. Yes, sir.
I got a picture of the Verona station from Mr. Miller, runs the dad who runs, guy who runs the grocery store, and we had it blown up, and it was in the convenience store that I built in Verona.
Oh,
So it was, so there it is around. He had, I got the picture from him. So
is it there now?
the big blow up is still there, I believe.
Which convenience store is this? 'Cause
It was the Verona Depot on Wayland Road by
oh,
PB and Wayland, the BP. It's since changed names, but
Okay.
it's Vincenzo Plaza right now. So
I'm gonna definitely stop there.
stop there. It's a
neat.
big picture. We did want it for the signing station too.
So you got that from Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Yeah, my daughter Allison used to work for him. Would have known that, you know.
And I looked very hard to find a picture of it because that was the theme we were using, and he was the only one I could find had a picture.
Wow. I used to go around the state and around the country taking pictures of depots, but unfortunately by the time I did that line, it was gone, as you can see. But I did capture a lot of them that were still standing along that line in the early 70s, so there's quite a few of them. Madison subdivision was, it's a real shame that was, had become what it is today. The track still exists, but that's all we can say about it. It was Madison's only main line. All these lines that came into Madison, Lockyer Road, IC, and the other Northwestern lines were just branches. But this was the main line. It came up Chicago to Harvard, which is still a main line. There's still a lot of metro service going to Harvard. But they had all these different lines going in different directions. One went up through Janesville to Evansville, one through Beloit, Afton, Footville, Evansville, another Afton, Janesville, and up. And then it became double track at Evansville because it took all this traffic from the different lines, funneled it together, went through Brooklyn, Oregon, Sign, which is in Fitchburg, Madison, and continued double track all the way up to Elroy. So if you can't read the other towns along the line, it's Wanakee, Lodi, Merrimack, Devils Lake, Baraboo, North Freedom, Rock Springs, Reedsburg, Laval, Wanna Rock Union Center, and Elroy. Elroy was a major divisional point. It was actually a junction between the Chicago Northwestern and their subsidiary, Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha. And Omaha line continued north to Wyville and then went west. And the track going to the left to Sparta and going through Sparta and then going down from Wyville down this direction was Northwestern. In 1957, the Omaha Road was fully merged into the Northwestern, but they were operating as one railroad pretty much. Elroy has lost everything. It was a major center. They still have their depot, but everything else is gone, all the lines through there. And the double track line is completely removed from Elroy to Reedsburg, and it is active from Reedsburg to Madison, but not very often, just a few times a week. There's business in Reedsburg, Baraboo, a little bit in Wanakee, and Madison's got some business. But unfortunately, south of Madison through Fitchburg, there isn't anything at all left today. The track's in place, but that's it. Union Pacific's the current owner from Harvard. They go up to Jamesville. Until recently, that was an important line to them because of the General Motors plant. The shutdown of the GMC plant in Jamesville meant it went from 2 freights a day to 3 freights a week. And they're thinking about pulling out of Jamesville entirely now. They go up to Evansville to serve there's a big new grain terminal south of town, and they'll go up there when needed. But I think UP's just thinking about abandoning everything. The other lines are long gone through Afton, Beloit. The UP does go into Beloit on a different line, but they've abandoned their own trackage. And I don't know what's going to happen to the line through Fitchburg. Doesn't sound too good. I think eventually it's going to be ripped up and made into another bike trail. There were a number of trains that were on this double-track main line. It was constructed in 1864, the second railroad to serve Madison. And 1864 is kind of early for the upper Midwest for railroads, and it was a very important line at the beginning. It became the Chicago Twin Cities main line of the Northwestern. Traffic picked up so much that they double-tracked the single-track line. They added block signals. And in the 1890s, till about 1910, it was very, very heavy traffic, a lot of freights, a lot of passenger trains. And Madison was well served by passenger traffic and freight. And in 1911, they built the Adams Cutoff, which on the map is the line that went up through South Beaver Dam to Adams to Wyville. And that siphoned off quite a bit of the freight traffic. But this remained, they had a couple of freights a day, very heavy for passenger service through the years. By 1953, they decided they didn't really need the double track south of Madison, so they took out the stretch through Fitchburg. It became single track, what it is today, but it was well maintained. It was good for 80 miles an hour. And they kept sidings, formal double track at places like Oregon, Brooklyn, Evansville. They were all kept, like 2-mile stretches of the old double track was left in place. And Oregon, as a matter of fact, even though the main track is dormant, the siding is still in place down there. Just hasn't been used. The siding depot was typical. The Northwestern preferred to have a station building about every 8 miles or so, sometimes less than that. And siding was built to serve the area. They had a few businesses. They had a livestock yard here and a few businesses, and they wanted an agent here. So this was built in 1864 when the line was put in. And it was closed early 1926 and torn down in 1935. So the siding depot's gone, and it was no longer recognized as a station until sometime after 1942 when they took out the siding. But Fitchburg still had all this traffic, heavy traffic. Rich has told me a number of times about the World War II traffic that went through, and as many as 40 trains a day passed through Fitchburg on this line during World War II. There were a number of passenger trains, a number of freights, but what really picked up was all the troop trains. A number of Army troop trains sent through here, other military trains, tanks, and that type of thing, and prisoner of war trains. Wisconsin had 38 prisoner of war camps, and surprisingly, a lot of them were around here, like Camp Lodi, where the Columbia County Fairgrounds, or I should say Lodi Fairgrounds, is today, was a POW camp for German and Japanese prisoners. And so a number of these POW trains would come up the line and drop off prisoners at these various sites, and a lot of them were along Northwestern. And they also served Camp McCoy, major military place. So there was a lot of military action on this line during World War II. After World War II, things kind of settled down to 11 passenger trains and about 6 freights a day. And from 1946 to 1950, they had a northbound train called the Madisonian and a southbound train called the Capital 400. In addition to that, we had 2 trains that went Chicago to Twin Cities through Madison, through Fitchburg. One was called the Viking, appropriate for Minnesota Vikings, and the Victory, and that was named after Indian victory over Indian battles. And those 2 plus an overnight train going up to Duluth Superior called the Duluth Superior Limited. In 1950, the Capital 400 and the Madisonian were replaced by the Dakota 400, which became our top train. That became Madison's really best train we had. It was a streamlined train with dining car, sleeping cars, lounge car. It was a fast train going 80 in many places. And so throughout most of the 50s, the Dakota 400 was the top train. And that went out to Huron, South Dakota, and later to Rapid City, South Dakota. And it also had connecting service. There was a connecting train from Milwaukee to Madison that connected with the Dakota 400. And a friend of mine who remembers back in 1955 or 56, riding with his parents out of West Dallas, where he was living at the time, on this connecting train, taking it to Madison and then changing over to the Dakota 400 and riding it all the way out to Huron, South Dakota, where his grandparents lived. And he says he never forgot that, even though it's that many years past. He was only 5 years old. And eventually, in 1960, in October, they decided to drop the western end of that run. And they cut it off at Mankato, Minnesota. And the train passed through Rochester first, and then Mankato was the next divisional point after Rochester. So they cut it back to Mankato. There was enough passenger business to warrant keeping it for a while. So they renamed the Dakota 400 the Rochester 400. Prior to that, though, Northwestern's management was changing, and Ben Heineman was an executive that took control of the Northwestern about 1956 or so. And he decided that Northwestern had way too many passenger trains, and the track structure and everything was not the best, and he wanted to modernize the railroad, put in computers, get rid of passenger trains as much as possible. And Ben did a lot of good things to strengthen up the Northwestern, but one sad thing he did was try to get rid of trains as quickly as possible, the money-losing ones. So his program involved dropping a lot of trains in Wisconsin. A deal was made with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission in 1957. If we introduce new equipment, bi-level equipment, to our main market, which is Chicago, Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Upper Michigan, we'll be allowed to drop all these local trains that nobody rides, and their mail express trains, locals, can we drop all of these trains? And so the state decided, yeah, this modern equipment would be a big improvement. So they're allowed to drop like 60 trains in one whack, just like that. And it did have an effect on Madison. In 1957, the Viking was taken off. And then in 1959, they took off the Victory. So that left, after 1960, just the Rochester 400, which passed through Madison during the daytime, the Duluth Superior Limited, which passed through during the night, and then local trains 507, 508, 510, and they stopped everywhere, Oregon, Brooklyn, Evansville, but they carried U.S. mail. In fact, they had a railway post office car on it where mail was sorted along the way. And that actually was a profitable operation for them. And 1961, they took off the Duluth Superior Limited, leaving just the Rochester 400 and just that mail express local. That was all we had left in Madison at that point. But in 1962, if you wanted to go to the Twin Cities, it was pretty convenient. The Rochester 400 came up through Fitchburg, stopped in Madison and Blair Street at about 1:45 in the afternoon. When it got up to Wyville, north of Elroy, it connected with the Twin Cities 400, which was Northwestern's bread and butter, one of their top trains, that came up through Milwaukee, South Beaver Dam, to Adams, Wyville. The trains met each other at Wyville. We had a cross-the-platform change. Then you went on to the Twin Cities on the Twin Cities 400. Despite changing trains in Wyville, you're up at St. Paul already at 7 o'clock that night, and Minneapolis at 7:40. Coming back, it was even better. At noon, you left Minneapolis, you left St. Paul at 12:30, you were back in Madison at 5 o'clock. I mean, for that time, before we had interstate highways, that was fast trip. And it was tragic that on July 23rd, 1963, the Rochester 400 and the Twin Cities 400 were both discontinued. And especially the Twin Cities 400, it was premature to take that off so early, because a lot of people did ride that train. It was the last train to serve cities like Eau Claire, and it was the last northbound, or last passenger train north of Madison that we had. So that left us with just trains 507, 508, 510. Along this period of time, Rich was dating my sister Margie and took us down to where he lived with his parents at the time, and I remember spending a few nights with him there. And he says, hey, there's a passenger train that goes through here about 7:30 at night. So that was the southbound train from Madison, the Mail Express train. And that's when I started to become interested in the Fitchburg railroads. And I was really excited to see this Northwestern passenger train go by Blaney Farms. And that New Year's Eve, December 31st of 63, and January 1st of 64, we went down to Aurora, Illinois for a family wedding and came back. My brother Gene and Rich and I drove back, and we decided to spend the night with Rich. And that gave me an opportunity to stay up till 2:30 in the morning to see the northbound Mail Express train, train 507, come up. So that was cool, even though you guys are wondering what it's with, you know. But that was cool. And I'll go on to the next one.
Sorry?
Oh, yes, sir.
The picture, that picture was given to me, and that's how it happens to be in this, of the sign depot, by the wife of the man standing there, the station master, was Vern Sykes.
Can you go back? Yeah, so the wife of the person standing there.
Yes.
Wow, so the wife of the depot agent.
Yeah, he died in 38, but he was kind of a cradle robber. She was quite a bit younger than he was. So she was a teen bride, and he was an older man. So anyway, but I knew her, and she's the one that gave me that picture.
Wow, that's neat. Well, you're quite the source of information. Maybe you should be up here giving this stuff.
We built a convenience store at that location just ahead of that. That's called the Signing Depot. It's on the same, close to the same grounds. You step out the back door, and we have found, I know where the framework for the base was still there when I was a kid.
Wow, that's neat. Thanks for sharing. Now, these are example of the block signals that were used on the Madison subdivision. These are called semaphores. When the blade went straight up in the air, the light was lit green, it meant proceed. At an angle, it was yellow, and that meant caution. And if it went all the way down, the blade was straight across horizontal. Red light, that meant stop. Semaphores were a common signal until the 20s and 30s, when they started to be replaced by more modern color light signals. But Northwestern, that was their standard signal. They had them all over the place, system-wide. Friends of mine decided, myself and two friends, that why don't we hike out to each of these signals statewide? It'd be kind of a fun way to get some exercise. And that's back when I was about 70 pounds lighter. And I wish that there were still signals to hike to like this. Maybe I could lose some weight. But anyway, we did that. We hiked out to 288 different sets of signals like this. And some of these pictures were made into photo CDs that a friend of mine sells. But some of these were quite a walk to get to. One day we walked 16 miles to get pictures of just 3 sets of signals up north of Reedsburg. But I'm glad we did that. It was to cover most of these lines that we took pictures of. The signals are all gone. In fact, all the semaphores are gone. Much of the track is gone now. And I'm just glad for history reasons that we did this. But these semaphore signals, there were several sets within Fitchburg. This set was down by Blaney Farms along Sign Road. And I certainly remember them in 63, 64. They stayed around until at the bottom there, early 1985, when they put in, next slide, put in these modern color light signals, which look like highway traffic signals. But I was glad that at least we still had signals along the line. It was still important enough to keep them, but then they were taken out in 1989, and then the signals were discontinued north of Janesville in 1990, and now they're taking them out from Janesville to Harvard. And this was still quite an important line even in 1986. This is over by Blaney's. In fact, that's Blaney's corn wagons in the background. My favorite locomotive, F unit, with this bulldog design that was very common when I grew up, and now there's very few of them left, none really in regular service anymore, but I still get excited today if I see an F unit. I don't care how old I am, I feel like I'm 5 again. And so here's a set of 4 of them in a southbound freight of 576 taken from the County M Bridge. And if you went up to the yard on Johnson Street, the Northwestern yard was on Johnson Street and Commercial Avenue. They had a roundhouse and engine facilities. On a summer morning and Sunday mornings, you could see up to 21 different locomotives parked there, including sets of F units and other rail locomotives. And I was in my glory back then. Here's another train passing by Blaney Farm, Sign Road. You can see the semaphores in the upper picture there in the distance. In 1974, this was a more typical power for Madison trains called GP30s. They were built in the early 60s. And we had, well, maybe 80 to 100 car freights. There was enough traffic. Oscar Mayer was a major shipper. In fact, the Illinois Central in 1966 wanted to serve Oscar Mayer plant. It already was served by Milwaukee Road and Northwestern. There was so much business coming out of Oscar Mayer that Milwaukee Road switched the plant twice a day, and Northwestern was right next to their yard, so they could hop over there throughout the day if they wanted to. And my wife's father worked for Milwaukee Road as a switchman, and I remember him telling me how he used to switch Oscar Mayer all the time. And my wife's mother used to work at Oscar Mayer, and there was more than one occasion she was on a loading dock when the train came in and her husband was switching the plant. And, but anyway, a lot of this was Oscar Mayer traffic, but there was a lot of business in Madison. Then we had Gisholt manufacturing and shipped a lot, a number of customers that aren't there today. And we had a lot of steam excursions. The line had a history of a lot of special trains. We had circus trains that came through here. We had business trains, Northwestern company officials, including the president of the company, would come through on business trips to inspect the line and so on. For the longest time, Madison still was important to Northwestern. They had a really nice station on Blair Street that they closed in early 1965 and sold to Madison Gas and Electric, and that became MG&E's headquarters building. And they moved into a new yard office in Johnson Street, which stands today, and that's where the final passenger trains left from us, from this building on Johnson Street. That's now the regional headquarters of Wisconsin and Southern, our local railroad. And in 1984, Northwestern sponsored passenger excursions on the Madison subdivision, both north and south of Madison. You could get on Johnson Street and ride down to Oregon and back, or go up to Wanakee and back. And so my friends bought a ticket for both runs and then chased it the other run. So this is just a scene taken at those semaphores of the steam-powered train. This was neat. The steam locomotives from 1907. It's an original Northwestern locomotive that Mid-Continent Railroad Museum owns. And right now it's been under repair now for a number of years. But it was out on the main line back in those days, going out to 40 miles an hour maybe. It was really neat. And then right behind it's F units again. Wow, I was just higher than a kite when I was taking these pictures. And this last one shows the track just north of Clayton Road. If you go down there now today, it's just all rusty track, bushes and stuff growing all over the place. The very last freight train to go through here was in 1996, so it's been 14 years since there's been a train on the Madison subdivision in Fitchburg. The track's still in place, but there's been nothing on it. At that time, you can see a boxcar or two on the left side there on that siding. The beverage warehouse used to ship beer and stuff out of there, and they had all this business that's been lost over the years. But the track was still, you can see the track's in good condition, so even in 1986, Northwestern still had pride to maintain the line and stuff. In 1995, Northwestern was taken over by the Union Pacific, which is America's largest railroad, and they've gobbled up a lot of railroads, Missouri Pacific, Western Pacific, and a number of others. And they are huge, big business. And it only took them a year to decide that Madison is backwater puddle jumper place. So they ended service to Madison in 1996, 1 year after taking over Northwestern. So the line sits dormant, and I hope it's got a more promising future, but my gut feeling is that eventually you'll see the track removed and made into another bike trail.
Bert? The city actually owns that chunk of track. We own it all the way from McCoy Road south to Evansville. So we own about a 15-mile piece.
So are we going to keep it?
We intend to. We've actually started talking with Wisconsin Southern and a little bit with UP about eventually having some kind of either bus rapid transit or maybe some kind of rail bus that will connect from the new development that we'll have over there down to where the high-speed rail station will be in Madison.
Oh, that would be nice. Now, is there any still talk of an industry at the Oregon Industrial Park, or is that done with?
That's really up to Oregon. Lycon was looking to locate there, but when construction slowed down, Lycon kind of shut down the plans to build that plant down there. So I think when construction picks back up, Lycon will probably do that again.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. So I guess we're going to be able to keep our line. Thank you. So if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I just want to thank you all for showing up and appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Phenomenal memory of all this data. And thank you for presenting it. I have two questions. One is, do you remember all those water things that used to be sticking up in the air over the tracks to fill up the steam engines with
Water towers.
I didn't see any of those, but
Because by the time I got around to taking my pictures, they
They
took
all
them
went
down.
down.
But I remember, like on the Adams cutoff, there was a water tower at Dalton that was still there in the 60s, but unfortunately, I wasn't taking pictures yet of that. But I do remember water towers at different places, but I came along too late to see a lot of these, and they used the water towers for steam locomotives. When I was a little kid, my first memory of a train is a steam locomotive, but shortly after that, they disappeared.
then the other question I had is, like, you were talking about that excursion train going down to Oregon and then coming back. How do they turn it around? Do they just back up all the way? go
They had
back?
locomotives on both ends. They had the steam
Oh.
locomotive in front, and they had a diesel on the other end, so they didn't have to worry about turning it. So the steam engine backed up and was pulled by the diesel on the other end, so that took care of that problem.
Thanks.
Yeah. But that was fun to ride, it really was. Yes, sir.
Maybe before your time, but the old roundhouse at what's Regent and West Washington, what did that belong to?
That was Milwaukee Road's big roundhouse that they had. And that lasted till 1980, and in the late 70s, Milwaukee Road still used that quite well because they were rebuilding locomotives for their company. So there'd be all these locomotives brought up from Chicago, their big yard in Chicago, to Madison, and there'd be employees that would rebuild locomotives in that roundhouse. Plus, we had enough business to keep 4 engines in there to switch the local area, which is hard to believe today, because 1 engine can switch the whole city, really. So, but that was Milwaukee Road's roundhouse. Yes?
In the early 50s, there was a double track that went through Fitchburg, and Mrs. Labor, who worked at Lady Farms, was killed, hit by the train, just between Lacey Road and a little closer to Irish Lane by the Stolman Farm. And she had saw the one train coming on the one track and moved over for it, and thought the noise was from the train that went by, and the noise was from the train that was coming towards her, and she didn't see it.
I had heard the story about her dying, but I didn't realize that was the reason. I heard that she'd frozen from fright, but I didn't realize because it was still double track. She thought, she was safe. That unfortunately happened a number of times with double track lines in Wisconsin. That cars, when they didn't have gates, would have the flasher signals going. They think, oh, well, the freight's done with, now I can cross, blam, and they get hit by a high-speed passenger train on the other track.
Regarding this team, where did the water for these water towers come from? Was that rainwater, or was it pumped up there? Or?
It was pumped up there in most cases. There were some places around the country where they used rainwater to catch it, but in most cases they had a pump, like a windmill. In fact, a lot of places, like Mount Horeb was one place where they had a water tower and they had a windmill right next to it that helped pump the water into the water tank there. Mount Horeb.
gravel road.
Yes, sir.
87 miles an hour with a 37 foot. And we were keeping up the standard of all that.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'm Lloyd Broman, and I have a question regarding the Illinois Central, which goes up through the center of our farm. We're both sides of Seminole Highway and the tracks that run alongside it. I didn't hear you know, just what year was that put up through there?
When was the actual railroad constructed?
Yeah,
1887.
okay.
And what I didn't mention was that the Stewart Tunnel between Belleville and Monticello, it took so long to cut through that hillside, put the tunnel in there, that it was the winter of 1887, 1888 before it was done. So the line was open as a through route from Madison to Freeport 1888 in February. But the track through Fitchburg was in place in 1887 already. So I don't know if Seminole Highway was there yet, but the track was in place at that time.
I have a picture here too of that steam train. I don't know who took it, and I think it came from a postcard that was blowing up right down in front of our house.
Well, that is neat.
And Seminole Highway runs along here, and
Why don't you put it up by the camera too, if you still on?
can you blow it up or?
Have some refreshments before you leave. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
There's a lead mine up on the top of that hill too, which the crater is still there. It's been filled in, and but I have several other stories I'll relate later in regard to things I remember about it and things that my dad told me.
Here, why don't you tell everybody, I'm sure there'll be people out there interested.
Well,
If you want to.
Yeah, my dad has told me a lot of stories about it, and I remember some too. We lived on a neighboring farm on Muchler Road. Well, it was Wilson Muchler's farm, actually, from 1944 till 1955. And that's just this side, or this one country block of Seminole Highway. And we didn't actually live on the home farm there, which was homestead in 1837 by my great-grandfather and two brothers, which would be great-great-uncles. At one time, my grandpa lived on Went Road down in Fitchburg. My dad attended both the Stoner School, which is in our farm, and up in the corner of our woods that we own. And the Maple Corners school down along Highway M, which when they lived, my grandpa lived for a period of time in Old Fitchburg on Went Road, and grandpa walked the tracks up to New Chores and that with my great uncle and his actually Hiram, who was my great grandfather. Dad had a lot of stories and sayings about it. He had a bad experience at one time. His brother, Vernon, who was 2 years older than him, was killed by the train at the intersection of Adams Road and Went Road, on the
Just
north
north
end
of
of
where the
Old
depot was.
Fitchburg there, yeah. It was a car accident. They were actually building a neighbor's barn, and he was riding with somebody that tried to beat the train, and both of them were killed.
Sorry to hear about that.
And that was I believe that was around 1925. Because Vernon, I believe, was 12, Dad was 10. And, but I remember the train too. It had close calls with it. When we lived on the home farm there, we used to pasture cows both across the road. And as well as we have land south of Whalen Road, which was, we have permanent pasture down there in lowland, which we actually didn't break till 1958, part of it. Not quite half of it. There's about 80 acres there. Well, it wasn't even close to half. We actually broke about 28 acres out of it. But we used to herd cattle down along there, my brother and I. And we had a few times that, well, you had to listen to hear if that train was coming or not, whether it was from Madison or what, and it was around times that we'd be taking them to pasture. And
So
there
it
were a
wasn't
few-
one of your cows that we hit, was it?
No, no, it was a few times we had close calls, and I remember one time, and that would have had to been sometime in the 60s, when we were doing that, late 50s and in the 60s. We were actually herding cattle down along there at pasture. And I know one time we heard them in Fitchburg. We just had them started. We were down along the woods there along Seminole Highway, and cows, some of them wanted to be on one side of the track, some on the other. Anyway, we'd had some close calls, and they could see them from a ways, and they would slow down. But this one time, they just kept coming. And part of them were on the other side with my brother, and part were on my side. Nobody made any wrong moves. And I remember when they went through, one of the engineers, or the engineer, was sitting on the side with his head down, foot up in the window. He was obviously sleeping, I suppose. I don't know where the other guy was, but they never let up. They just went right through, and no, nobody got hit. I also remember at times, I can't really say when the years were, it seemed like at least 5 or 6 years in a row that when they had passenger trains that would go up through, which we seldom saw. I can't say for sure if it was in the 60s or 70s, but
Forgot to mention there were football specials.
well, these dads said they were around the beginning of June, and they were orphans from an orphanage in Moose Heart, Illinois. Dad told me, and they had sort of a spring outing that they bring those kids up to the zoo in Madison. It was sort of an outing for the orphans, I guess, and it was sort of a special. I mean, I seldom saw passenger cars on the Illinois Central in my time, but I wasn't actually there at the home farm.
Well, the Illinois Central in the 1960s was very pro-passenger. They would have been a railroad that would be happy to charter trains for people. They had a president that was very much into running quality passenger trains
Yeah.
at that time.
Yeah. it's-
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Paul tells me about his grandfather, but after he left the farm and moved to Madison, and would come out on the train, and they'd go over to Beanville and pick him up.
Wow,
So there was passengers.
He'd come out and help my dad with, when they were at haying time and things like that. We'd go over there in the morning and pick him up, and then he'd be there all day, and then we'd drive him back into Madison at night.
Wow, so you remember that Beanville Union Station, huh?
Oh, yeah.
It's great.
You're talking about water towers. Isn't there one still up out by Dodgeville yet?
Oh, there's a coaling tower, yeah. Yeah, out
Yeah.
west of Dodgeville at Montfort.
Yeah.
It's a big, giant concrete coal tower, and they haven't taken it down because it's too expensive to take it down, so it's just in a farmer's field now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'll try those new windmills. Yeah, it's weird to see an old holding tower next to a modern set of windmills. Yeah.
30, 40 of them out there.
Yeah, up by Montfort. But there is actually a working water tower at North Freedom at the Mid-Continent Railroad Museum.
Oh, is there?
They actually use it for, well, they did use it for the steam locomotives. Yes, ma'am.
Did you want to mention about the Fighting O'Sullivan, the Fighting Sullivans?
Oh,
I know
yeah.
the story, that shows a water tower with little
That's-
boys on it.
My wife Joan called me into the room this week because she was watching this old movie called The Fighting Sullivans. And I sat down with her and we watched it all the way through. It was a great film. But the Sullivan family it was real tragic. They had 5 sons that all went to war together in World War II, and they all were killed together on a ship by the Japanese in 1942. And after that, they changed the law so you can't have 5 family members together in one ship. But the Sullivans lost all 5 sons, and it's a story about the family growing up, the boys growing up, and their daughter. And there was a water tower there in the movie, and the father was a conductor on the Illinois Central. And in fact, I was thinking of that film when I mentioned Waterloo, Iowa. That's where this takes place. The father was a conductor out of Waterloo, and at the end, when he was such a dedicated Illinois Central worker that at the end, when he found out, the military guy came over and says, I'm sorry to give you this news. They said, which one? He said, all 5. And he just, oh no, not all 5. But he says, I'm a conductor, and then there's a steam locomotive whistle in the background. I'm a conductor for the Illinois Central, and I have to go to work now. So at the end of the movie, he goes to the Illinois Central Yard in Waterloo and climbs into his caboose and looks at the water tower because he remembers his sons waving to him when they were young. And off the train goes. And it ends with the 5 sons up in heaven and walking on the clouds. Thanks for bringing it up, but I highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, The Fighting Sullivans. It's a movie from 1944. A little tearjerker and a true story. Yes?
Oh, then what did we just read? The story of Saving Private Ryan was based
Yeah.
on that family.
The more current movie, Saving Private Ryan from...
But that was Army or...
Yeah, it was kind of,
Navy.
it was based on that, and it was, in that case, they had changed the rules so that in that case, he was trying to find his brother. Yeah. Rich here is quite the authority in World War II, and he's quite familiar with that, and knows the whole story of the Sullivan family. But it's a real touching film, and I'm glad we watched it last week. So.
If anybody wants to borrow it, I got it in my library. Plus about 1,000 other World War II and Civil War movies. So.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever seen any of the track pans that they used to have that they took on water?
I haven't seen them personally because they removed them before my time. That was used for steam locomotives, but I've read a number of articles. When I was growing up, a lot of the magazines I subscribed to would have articles about the track pans. And I'm not sure if there were any in Wisconsin, but it certainly was common out east. Yeah,
I knew of some of them. I mean, I haven't seen any either, but I knew a guy that worked as an engineer.
No.
He worked on a steam train. And he talked about they took on water on the run out of those track pans.
For those people who
their
don't
movement would jam it right up.
Yeah.
They'd lower at the signal into these pans, and they'd take water into the tender on the run.
It saved time, like New York Central had them out east, so the 20th Century Limited, their top train, so they didn't have to take the time to stop at a water tower and take on water. The track pans, it was a bunch of water there, and it had scoop up the water and put it right into the tender at speed. And that was used at different places, especially out east, but I've never seen them personally because they'd already taken them out.
Yeah, in this case, it happened to be down across Illinois, down below Chicago. They were hauling a troop train across to I don't know if it's Colorado, or they're from Indiana across to Colorado or somewhere. Anyway, in his case, it wasn't good. It took cold water into the tender, and they needed it right away, and it blew the boiler.
Oh, jeez. That's probably why not everybody used track pans. You know, it worked sometimes it didn't work. Then in the wintertime, it'd freeze up. But it did save, when it did work properly, it saved time without having to stop at the water towers.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes?
I run a railway. I run a railway. And guess what kind it is?
Is it a Santa Fe?
Nope.
Is it a Chicago Northwestern?
Nope.
Is it
It's
Milwaukee Road?
Lego.
It's what?
Lego.
A Lego? Oh, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, but it's not really a Thomas engine. All it is just a express engine with one car. There are a
Oh,
bunch of buildings and there's only one train running.
well, it's a little railroad, but it's your railroad. That's what makes it important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for telling us about your railroad.
Thank you very much, Vern. Very interesting talk. Good.